All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to another exciting episode of my daily vlog. This is the daily vlog number 175. And today, first things first, I'm doing better. I think I just had a long recovery time from that seizure. Normally, not going to get into it. Normally, recovery time is like I can't move for like 20, 30 minutes, and then within, I don't know, like 4 to 6 hours, I'm mostly okay. This one took a few days. I don't know what that means. I've got therapy tomorrow. I'll talk with my therapist about it, but whatever. So, today, I want to talk about a topic that I've brought up already, which is we've been doing this little kind of sub-series in my daily vlog where I just talk about kind of game design, and now we're focusing on specific classes, and due to the fact that I've been playing a crap ton of Shadow of the Erdtree, the DLC for Elden Ring. I mentioned in my last video they introduced a new weapon type called martial arts, which allows you to punch and kick bad guys to death, which is super, super fun. But it made me start thinking about the monk as far as a class is concerned. And so I thought for today that we talk about, what exactly is a monk and kind of the difficulties in game design when you're trying to create a monk style character. So, I got my orange juice because it helps. So, first of all, let's talk about what the monk is. Monk is probably the furthest removed class from what the actual meaning of the name is, as far as what people envision when they're dealing with a monk class. Monks are basically the male version of nuns. They live in a monastery, which is where the name monk comes from, and they basically just kind of devote themselves to studying a religion. The monks that I am the most familiar with are Catholic monks. And because monasteries have existed in the Catholic faith for centuries, fun fact, before the printing press and things like that, monks and monasteries and things like that were actually one of the places where a lot of written works came from, because that's one of the things that monks would do, is they would literally copy down books and things like that, because monks, compared to the average populace at the time, monks were, first of all, literate, which was not something outside of the nobility there were, and monks had time. While yes, a lot of monasteries were relatively self-sufficient in the fact that they would grow their own food and stuff like that, monks still had a lot of other things, because it was a bunch of people living together, and so they had a lot of different things that they would do. They would study scripture and things like that, but one of the other things they would do is they would copy books. A lot of those were copying scripture, but it wasn't exclusive to just religious texts. So that's what a monk actually is someone that just kind of devotes themselves to a religion. And depending on the kind of flavor of monk you are talking about, most monks have certain vows that they are required to take in order to become a monk. One of the ones that's most common is a vow of poverty, which basically means that they won't attempt to accumulate wealth or anything like that. Other ones that are relatively common, things like vows of chastity, where they're not allowed to have sex in any way, shape, or form. It means that they're celibate their entire lives, things like that. And there's other ones that will that will vary between religions and just different monastic traditions as well. Things like vows of service and other things like that. So, how does people that copy books and study religious texts turn into martial arts masters? Well, outside of things like Franciscan monks or, the kind of Catholic monks that are the ones that I think of when I hear the term monk, probably some of the most famous monks around the world nowadays is a group called the Shaolin monks. And they are very, very similar to Catholic monks and the things like that, and the idea that they do kind of devote themselves to the study of a religion. However, part of that study and part of their beliefs is that in addition to cultivating the mind by meditating and reading and learning about the religious texts, which I believe the Shaolin monks are Buddhist. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments down below. They also believe that you should also be training the body, and that by training the body and cultivating your physical prowess, it will help you to become more enlightened. So Shaolin monks study Kung Fu. They technically have a couple different styles that they study, but there's kind of a blanket term for Shaolin Kung Fu. There's variations, like there's differences between Northern Shaolin and Southern Shaolin and the things like that. But that's the thing that people are most familiar with when they think of Shaolin monks. And Shaolin monks do not shy away from this. If you go to I've watched quite a few different YouTube videos of a former Shaolin monk who's talked about the fact that the Shaolin Temple is a tourist destination. And there are parts of the temple that tourists are not allowed to go in. But for the most part, people come to see the monks. And the monks themselves, because what they do, first of all, is very physically demanding. And second of all, is really freaking amazing to watch. They put on demonstrations and things like that for tourists, and there's documentaries and stuff like that that go to various Shaolin temples and the things like that. Like, it's a really, really common thing. So when you are talking about the monk class, in general, that's what people are thinking about, is a Shaolin monk who, in addition to dedicating themselves to a religion, they dedicate themselves to study of a particular style of martial arts, or maybe multiple styles of martial arts, both of which are actually extremely common excuse me, for Shaolin monks in general. Like some monks specialize in a single a single style of combat. Other monks will study quite a few different ones. Again, Shaolin Kung Fu is a kind of blanket term that incorporates a lot of different martial styles and weapon styles as well. And I'm just going to go monk class D. There we go. I just wanted to get something to remember how all this stuff goes. So, when we talk about the monk class, again, we always tend to go back to D&D because, again, it was the first tabletop RPG, and a lot of the tropes and things like that that exist in tabletop RPGs as a whole started with D&D. So we look at the monk. The monk originally showed up in the Men in Magic booklet from the original D&D set. And they particularly, and I'm going to read this right off the Wikipedia page, they specifically said clerics with the right combination of attributes could become monks, implying a religious calling for the monk class. The pinnacle of the monk's power was the quivering palm. And then the monk as a character class was introduced in the Blackmoor supplement. And the thing about the monk was it was a pain in the ass to be able to actually play a monk, because again, old school D&D, you not only rolled all your stats, you rolled them in order. So it was 3d6, you rolled them in order. And in order to be a monk, you basically had to have like above a 15 and like 3 or 4 different stats, which is hard to do. If you're rolling 3d6, your most common roll is going to be anywhere between a 6 and an 8. From a statistical standpoint, the most common roll is a 7. But if you open that up a little bit, anywhere between a 6 and an 8 is going to be well over half of your rolls are going to be between 6 and 8. The further to the ends of the spectrum that you get, the less you are, or actually that's 2d6. 3d6 is a little bit different. But the closer to the ends of the spectrum you get, the less common those rolls are going to be, because there's only a few combination of dice that can actually make that up. The reason that 2d6, the most common rolls, are 6, 7, and 8, is there are a bunch of different ways to get a 6. You can roll a 1 and a 5, a 2 and a 4, a 3 and a 3. All of those will give you 6s. But playing a monk in and of itself was not particularly easy to do, and they weren't super well defined either. Again, when we look back at old D&D classes in general, they were kind of built around the idea of this is how you interact with combat. If you use weapons, you're a fighter. If you use spells, you're a wizard or a magic user. You had a fighting man, a magic user, and then if you heal people, you're a cleric. Like, those are the 3 different things you could do, and then they would make variations on those with subclasses or kits and things like that, depending on the edition you're talking about. And then we talked about there was kind of a 4th class design idea, which was the thief. And the thief was built on the idea, well, what about all the other things outside of combat? You know, what about dealing with traps? What about ambushes, things like that? That's what the thief was really created to be able to deal with, was all the exploration stuff like that. And those are your basic kind of 4 groups of class types, and those still exist all the way to today. There's a lot more crossover than there was back then. Like, there's a lot more like, well, you use weapons, but you also use magic, so you're somewhere in between a fighting man and a magic user. Or, you know, you use weapons, but you also have some out of combat stuff that you do. So you're kind of in the middle of a fighting man and a thief. Or you use some weapons and you also use healing spells, or you can use healing spells and you can use damaging spells in the case of something like a red mage. You know, you kind of mix and match. When we look at the monk isn't really defined by a whole lot as far as combat is concerned, other than the fact that monks punch things. And that's really it. So when you look at what we have, monks don't use magic. They don't technically heal anyone. They're not technically created to be able to deal with a bunch of stuff outside of combat, and they don't use weapons. So now we have kind of a weird character, and that's been one of the biggest downfalls and pitfalls that class design for monks has had to deal with through every edition of D&D that have ever existed, and a lot of other games that try to introduce a monk style class, is it doesn't fit into a pretty box like the rest of them do. And it's one of the things that players will sometimes have issues with as well. Because I need another drink. Because they will see mechanics, like a really good example, the 5th edition monk. A lot of people think the 5th edition monk is a really, really weak class because look at all the attacks it gets, and yet a fighter can outdamage it every single time. The damage results because monks generally don't get to use magic weapons very often, and at least 1 or 2 attacks every turn has to just be with their fists. And 5th edition really didn't give monks any kind of magic gloves that they could wear or anything like that. And so people would go, well, this class gets so many attacks and gets them so early. Like, monks can get 4 attacks at level 5. Fighters don't get 4 attacks until level 19. Like, that's a really, really big difference. So a lot of people kind of got upset with the monks. It's like, well, why can't this thing do damage? It has so many attacks, and things that get extra attacks are meant to do damage. Look at every single one of these other class that gets extra attack is designed to do damage, and the monk isn't doing that. It's because the 5th edition monk was never designed to be a damage dealing class, and I've gone off on tirades about this before, but it creates some difficulty in understanding when mechanically there really isn't anything in 5th edition to explain the idea of a control-based class or an action economy controller type thing, which is what the monk is. There's no mechanics that explain that. It's just how the game works. It's in order to understand the monk, you have to understand a lot of game design. And when we go back into previous versions of the monk in D&D, the monk always seems to have a weird place, because some monks will be crazy powerful damage. They mentioned the Quivering Palm. Quivering Palm, again, is a kind of mythological, legendary attack that some Shaolin monks in legend could do, where they could hit someone and start these vibrations in them. And then, like, 7 days later, the person would just drop dead because the vibrations finally reached the person's heart. So it's basically this touch of death style thing where you weren't going to die immediately, but you were definitely dead. That's where the idea of the Quivering Palm comes from. And so again, when you hear about what their most powerful ability is, the ability to basically kill someone days later, you think damage dealing class. But that never really has worked well for the monk, because again, there's already damage dealers. And so basically letting a monk do the exact same thing like a fighter or a ranger can do, just without having to buy weapons or anything, starts to unbalance things. And so you always have this weird idea of what is a monk, what isn't a monk, what are they supposed to be good at, what aren't they supposed to be good at. So for this discussion, almost 20 minutes in, let's actually define what we're referring to as a monk. For me, if I am looking at building a monk class or a monk character in a tabletop RPG, no matter the tabletop RPG, there are certain things that the monk should be able to do. One, the monk should be able to attack barehanded. Without any weapons, the monk should be able to fight. And they should be better at it than any other class. If there's an ability to kind of punch and kick for every other class, the monk needs to be able to do that better than anyone else. In addition to that, something about the monk needs to have a supernatural effect to it. In 5th edition, they have Ki to be able to, a limited resource that allows them to do kind of supernatural things. Running faster than other characters, being able to kind of move out of the way and not get attacked when they're going around, things like that. They eventually get the ability to use that to channel into their attacks as well, things like Stunning Fist, other stuff like that. But they should have some kind of supernatural ability that is not tied specifically to magic. That's the thing that makes the monk unique, is their abilities are not magic. They are based on their mastery of their own internal energies. And for the most part, that tends to be the monk. Other things that are really, really popular that I think are kind of secondary things that don't have to be in there, but should probably be thought about. Monks should be hypermobile in some way. And when I say that, I mean they should be able to move further than other classes or go across terrain in a way that other classes can't. They should have something about them that allows them to move in a way that other classes can't. So that's, I just use the kind of blanket term of hypermobile, hyper prefix meaning more or extra. And then mobility. So they should have some sort of hypermobility, extra mobility that gives them the ability to do cool things. So that definition of the monk can fit a lot of different situations. And not all monks fight barehanded. It just needs to be something that a monk can do. Because even if we're looking at weapon-based monks, like monks that use staves or that use nunchucks or something, they still fight unarmed while still doing that. Like, part of learning the staff is not just striking with the staff. It's also the ability to strike with the staff and then kick or elbow or shoulder. One of the cooler things I've seen in some staff forms is you plant the staff on the ground and use it as leverage to basically throw a drop kick, where you use it to kind of lift yourself into the air, throw this very powerful kick, and because you have the ability to kind of ground yourself, you don't just fall to the ground. You can get back down and steady yourself with your staff. So even when they are using weapons, they're still expected to be able to use unarmed strikes and things like that. So that's our very basic definition of a monk. They can fight without weapons. They can fight barehanded. They have some sort of supernatural powers that are not completely explained with magic. And they have some kind of hypermobility built into them. So let's talk about the class fantasy for the monk. So that's what we're defining as a monk. But when a player picks a monk, what are the cool things that they want to be able to do? What are they expecting that, wow, I'm playing a monk, I'm going to be able to do this? And a lot of that goes into the definition. They want to be able to fight barehanded, but the class fantasy aspect of that, I'm going to take another drink. The class fantasy aspect of that is really based around the idea that monks and martial artists in general are viewed as being these characters that are always in control. When bad stuff happens, the monk can just react. They don't need to put their armor on. They don't need to draw their sword and everything. Just split second, something can happen and the monk is already into a fighting stance and being in combat. Whereas literally every other class, they need kind of a ready to it. Like if a wizard gets ambushed, they need at least a split second to kind of draw their casting implement so they can start casting spells. The monk simply doesn't. They're already ready for combat. And I think that's the real defining thing that, even if people don't realize that's what they're looking for, that's the thing that makes playing a monk fun, is in any situation, they already have all the tools that they need available and ready to them instantly. They don't have to draw a weapon. They don't have to they don't have to kind of prepare or unlock, draw an implement to cast their spells or anything. They're just there, and you can put them into a lot of situations, and they still feel like they're in control. And I think that's the most fun thing about the monk. And it goes into every single aspect. The fact that they can fight unarmed means that in a situation where combat starts, the monk feels in control. However, part of that ability to fight unarmed is that their fists and feet or shins or whatever are kind of magically augmented so that when they're punching steel armor, they're not breaking their hands. Fun fact, if you've never punched someone in the face, it's a remarkably bad idea. The reason why is if you punch someone in the face and the head is almost all bone. There's some muscles that go around here and here and here, but for the most part, it's a big, thick bone. It's one of the thicker bones in the body because it's designed to protect your brain. And then the jaw and the teeth are designed to grind up your food. All of the bones in here are very strong, and just because of how they're built structurally, other than a slight weakness in the jaw, because there's a joint here for the jaw, and that's not the most difficult thing to break, everything else on the face is remarkably hard to break. Your hand, on the other hand, is a bunch of small bones that are connected with tendons and cartilage. They're thin, they're relatively brittle. If you punch someone in the face, like you hit them here, or really, really bad, you hit them up here, you are more likely than not going to break your hand. It's just how it works. Now, martial arts in general don't have normal people hands. And what I mean by that is, I've seen quite a few people talk about how, breaking is stupid. If you've never heard of breaking as it applies to martial arts, one of the ways you train martial arts that has become very popular in the West, but it's been a part of martial arts for thousands of years, is the idea of breaking bricks or boards or things like that. And there's a lot of benefits to doing that. A lot of people look at it and go, well, it's pointless. You are just breaking something to show how awesome you are. And it's not. There are benefits to the very basic act of learning how to break boards is you have to learn how to throw a punch in a way that you don't strike the target, you strike through the target. Because if you just strike the target, you're going to bounce off it and it's going to remain unbroken. One of the most important things to do when you're learning breaking techniques is you actually have to strike through the target. The other thing is every time you impact something with your hand hard enough, you actually create these little microfractures. Bones in and of themselves are remarkably porous. So because of that, it's one of the reasons why they're so easy to break. It's one of the other reasons why they're relatively light compared to other things of the same kind of volume. So they're very porous. What happens when martial artists do breaking and things like that, board breaking, brick breaking, whatever it is they create these little microfractures. And the thing about bones is when you break a bone, it can repair itself because their bodies are amazing, but it always will repair itself stronger than it was before. So a trained martial artist that's been doing breaking techniques for years will actually have thicker bones that can survive more heavy impacts, and because the bones are thicker, they have more mass. And so a trained martial artist who has done breaking techniques actually has harder punches because velocity equals mass times acceleration. Mass is a part of the equation to how much velocity you have and how much impact you have when you hit something. Force relies on mass. There's an equation for force too that I can't remember off the top of my head. Force equals mass times acceleration, I think is what it is. I think that's what the equation is. Anyway, so going back to monks, because they have something special in them that allows them to strike things like steel without breaking their hands, that also means when there are situations that require physical encouragement outside of combat, breaking down a door, things like that. Monks can just do it. Whereas any other character will let me get my axe out, let me get my greatsword out. Monks just get to do it. And there is a lot of... it feels really cool to be in any situation and to have an answer to it without having to rely on anything but yourself. A monk in their underwear is still incredibly dangerous. A fighter in their underwear is funny. And a wizard in their underwear, depending on what kind of wizard they are, can either be funny or terrifying. So, yeah, I think that's the big class fantasy is that idea of when shit hits the fan, the monk is going to be in control and is always going to feel like they have something that they can do, whether or not they have all their weapons, their armor, anything. They're always going to feel like, no, I'm ready for this. And we see that a lot in Asian cinema, like Chinese Kung Fu cinema. A lot of times, these characters will just be walking around having conversation, and then suddenly fight breaks out. And they just instantly start doing super cool, awesome things. La, 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 la. And then it's over. And then they're going back to, yes, it is very good to see you. By the way, I love martial arts movies. Probably my absolute favorite, Ip Man with Donnie Yen, is so unbelievably amazing. Because first of all, the martial arts in it is amazing. But second of all, Donnie Yen is a phenomenal actor. And I've tried because I have a really hard time now with subtitles because I have double vision and my brain doesn't work the way it's supposed to. I've tried to watch Ip Man dubbed because it's just easier for me to be able to ingest it. You can't. You have to watch the actual Chinese language version of it with subtitles or learn Chinese. That's another thing you can do. It's not like Chinese is a difficult language or that it incorporates, something like a couple hundred different languages that are all relatively similar but still different enough that they're different languages. But yeah, so that's kind of the class fantasy. In addition to that, monks are flashy. There's a character who is a real person in Chinese history. He is the most portrayed character in Chinese cinema and television of all time. Literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different actors have portrayed the exact same character. That character is Wong Fei Hung. Wong Fei Hung was a doctor who was also a martial artist. And in folklore, he was a hero. Like, he would fight against injustice and stuff like that. He was a very, very cool character. And he has shown up just over and over and over again in Chinese cinema. He's one of the most well-known historical figures in China. And again, he was a real person, but he has also been kind of accelerated and grandiosed into a folk hero as well. One of the things that there's argument about whether he actually did this or if this is just folklore. But one of the things that he's known for is while he was attacking, each of the different strikes that he had, that he used, had different names. Things like monkey grabs the coconut, or mantis tears the cloth, or something like that. And so while Wong Fei Hung was fighting, he would be calling out the names of his attack, and it became typical for a period of time in Chinese films that if Wong Fei Hung was in it, he was always, instead of just going sha suya hut shima, he would also be going like tiger grabs the tiger slash and all this stuff, and he'd be calling out. Oops, didn't mean to do that. He'd be calling out the names of all of his attacks, and again, a lot of what Western audiences and tabletop audiences in general, because tabletop RPGs as a whole, are very Western centric. I'm not saying that there aren't Eastern made to tabletop RPGs. There's lots of them. I'm saying they started in the West, and the majority of them have a lot of Western themes. Like fantasy tabletop RPGs are by far the most common, and fantasy is based on medieval Europe. That's in general, that's what they are mimicking, is just medieval Europe in general. So, because the Western vision of a monk is that Shaolin monk, and a lot of times the only way, especially if you're going way back to the 70s, the only kind of way that anyone in the West was familiar with Shaolin monks and that was through martial arts movies, which are extremely flashy and extravagant. That's part of the other aspect of the monk class fantasy, is the idea that you want to be flashy. You want to be in control, or feel like you're in control of most situations. You want to feel like you're prepared for just about any situation. And you want to feel flashy. That hypermobility can lean into that flashy aspect, because quite a few monks in various tabletop RPGs, D&D 5th edition included, will eventually get the ability to do things like running on walls or running across water, things like that. That feels very, very flashy. And when you're someone like me, you can combine those things to create really, really flashy, interesting attacks, which are a lot more fun than the fighter going, I draw my longsword, I run forward, and I attack. Whereas the monk goes, okay, I'm going to run up this wall, I'm going to hop over his head, come down with a heel kick over his head, and then if he blocks that, I'm going to spin back and come back with a punch to his stomach, an elbow to his temple, and then an uppercut to just kind of knock him back. Like, that feels really, really flashy. And the fact that martial arts and unarmed attack in general don't have to be exclusively with your hands. They can be kicks and knees and all this stuff. All of that adds to the flashy nature, because mechanically, it's 4 attacks. Roll 4 times, see if you hit 4 times. It's all you do. But from a imaginative perspective and as a descriptive perspective, you know, you're not just going, you're going pow, pow, knee, kick, headbutt, whatever. Like, it feels very, very flashy and fun. And so that's really what I think a lot of people want when they're building a monk kick a character. They want to feel flashy. They want to have that feeling of, I can go into situations and I don't have to rely on my equipment. I can just rely on myself. Those are the things that they want. And I'm going to have an answer to a lot of different situations. Those are the things that people are looking at. So let's talk about class design. We've talked before with the fighter, with the idea that class design for a fighter requires you to allow them to do more than just make attacks. Are there versions of the fighter where that's all they do? Absolutely. The champion fighter in D&D 5th edition is kind of built around that idea. Is you're just going to go in, you're going to attack, and everything else is just kind of automated for you. There's a lot of passive abilities and things like that. I'm not saying that you can't do that. I'm saying that makes for a very boring class, and you're going to alienate a lot of people if all of your fighters are very passive and very I attack and then things happen. When we're looking at the monk, again, that hypermobility tends to translate into speed a lot of times. And that's not just speed in movement, it's speed in attacking. So when you're designing for the monk, giving them more attacks than other classes tends to be really, really common, because people simply don't want to accept the idea that a punch could do as much damage as a great sword or even a long sword. They see a long sword and they go, it's got a blade, it's metal. If I got hit by it, it would hurt a lot. And then they look at someone throwing a punch and they go, I have been punched. It's not fun. but I would rather be punched than hit with a longsword. And so to kind of make up for the fact that their weapons are going to be weaker, they allow them to just make more attacks with them, which is a really common combat design thing across RPGs in general. It's one of the ideas behind dual wielding in a lot of different systems. Again, 5th edition included. Is dual wielding, you will do less damage per hit, but you will get extra attacks. So on average, you're doing a similar amount of the damage as someone that's not dual wielding. And then as you start to specialize, you can start doing more damage and things like that. So monks tend to do relatively well when they have slightly lower damage dice, but they get to make more attacks and other things like that. However, again, the class fantasy is it needs to be flashy. It needs to feel supernatural as far as what they do. So one of the simplest things you can do, they do it in 5th edition at level 6, is basically make monk weapons or monk punches and things like that magic in some way. They have the ability to hit things that normal weapons would be less effective with. If there's a resistance system like they have in 5th edition, monks never have to worry about their punches being resisted because they're non-magical. Their attacks are inherently magical. They're inherently supernatural. So by writing something like that into your system where monks have the ability to get around some kind of defense, or they're immune to some sort of wear and tear that other weapons aren't, you already are starting to make the monk feel more special without having to change really a whole lot as far as balance is concerned. Yes, being able to get around certain resistances can make them quite powerful depending on how a resistance system works in your game. But you're not having to deal with, different dice sizes or damage amounts or anything. You're just kind of making these minor things that make a major change for how the character feels. In addition to that, monks need something that makes them feel a little bit more in control and the ability to do things that other classes can't. In 5th edition, the way that they get around this is through key, and specifically when you get your key, you get 3 different things. You get Step of the Wind, you get Flurry of Blows, and you get the third one that I used a lot more than I can remember. It allows you to take the defend action as a minor action or as a bonus action. Give me 2 seconds here. Cheese and rice. What's it called? Martial arts key. There we go. Florida patient defense. There we go. So you can take the dodge action as a bonus action, and then Step of Wind, disengage or dash. So Step of the Wind fits into that hypermobility thing where it allows you to kind of move around. While the disengage, that to me is a really, really important thing about being a monk, is this idea that the monk can kind of move around enemies and the enemies don't get a chance to trip them up or anything like that. If you have an opportunity attack system, which is extremely common in tabletop RPGs in general, giving the monk a way to get around or get out of opportunity attacks makes the character feel extremely in control. Because everyone else, due to how opportunity attacks is, if you're not familiar with the term, because sometimes they're called other things in different tabletop RPGs, opportunity attack is effectively if you are next to an enemy character and you try to leave, they get a free attack against you. Now, depending on the tabletop RPG, there are a lot of other things that might trigger an opportunity attack. In 3rd edition, everything triggers an opportunity attack. Firing ranged while you're in melee, opportunity attack. Getting up from prone, opportunity attack. Moving at all when you're near anyone else, opportunity attack. Like, opportunity attacks happened everywhere in the 3rd edition. But it is a very useful term to balance out ranged characters versus melee-based characters. If there is no penalty to just running away when someone is attacking you in melee, then there's no real reason to ever use a melee weapon. So it's a really, really common thing, and giving a monk some way to get around opportunity attacks, whether it's linked to a limited resource like it is for 5th edition, whether it's built into another ability, like if you make this particular attack, then the character that you attack can't make opportunity attacks against you. However you want to do it, those are things that make the monk, again, feel like it's in control, because other classes, once an enemy character gets close to theirs, they now have lost control over one aspect of their character. They can no longer move where they want to, because if they do, they might get punished for that. So some of their player agency is taken away. And that's not a bad thing. That's just kind of the result of the enemies being able to have some control in the combat as well. By giving monk characters something that allows them to circumvent that, they, again, feel like they're in control, because even when other characters would lose their player agency in this case, the monk character doesn't. So, again, from a game design standpoint, that hypermobility can just be extra speed, which is nice, but also the ability to interact with enemies in a way that other classes can't, whether that's by avoiding opportunity attacks. The ability to move through enemy squares is another one that I haven't seen a ton of monks do it, but I've seen it a couple to times. Can make it feel really, really powerful without, again, having to worry about, well, how many damage dice should we assign to it, all this other stuff. It's just stuff that makes the monk feel powerful without having to worry about damage numbers and other things like that. One of the things that they did in 4th edition, it didn't work super well because 4th edition, to be blunt, just didn't explain it very well. But in 4th edition, every single at-will power that the monk got was actually 2 powers in one. There was an attack, and there was a movement attached to that attack. So when you would do an attack, you would also have access to this special kind of movement, which might include the ability to shift, which was the 4th edition version of what was called a 5-foot step, which is basically a tiny amount of movement that didn't provoke opportunity attacks. 5th edition, they just call it disengage, and they treat it very differently. In 4th edition, as your entire movement, you could shift, which meant you just moved 5 feet, but you didn't provoke any opportunity attacks. And so casters would do that very often to be able to shift 5 feet away from the enemy so they were no longer in melee, and then they could cast spells without having penalties. In 3rd edition, they did the same basic thing, but it's called a 5-foot step. So if you're a ranged character, you would 5-foot step. All of your movement would be used for this 5 feet. But now that you're no longer in melee, you can shoot without having people get all these opportunity attacks for you. So in 4th edition, there were things where if you did this attack, you could shift up to half your movement. So it was no longer 5 feet. You could shift 15, 20 feet. And that meant you could move around and go wherever you wanted because it was tied to this action. Another one might be you could move and then move a character with you or things like that. And I think from a game design standpoint, I think that captures the essence of the monk and the class fantasy of the monk better than any other monk I have seen, because it ties the hypermobility to their kind of aggressive nature and their attacks and things like that. Like I said, the big issue that 4th edition had with it was really poorly explained in the books and everything like that. And it was very, very confusing compared to literally every other class, where your movement and your major action and minor action were 3 separate things. And for the monk, they weren't. So from a game design standpoint, giving... because they kind of do it in Pathfinder 2nd edition as well, where they give the monk kind of forms and things like that that allow them to do things differently. And as much as I'm not a huge fan of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, the stances in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, I think, really fit into that feeling of the monk and that player fantasy. In Pathfinder 2nd Edition, you have these stances where when you enter them, your unarmed attacks, the damage die changes. A lot of times the damage type will change, and you'll be able to do damage in a different way. And again, from a game design perspective, it kind of mimics the ability that a lot of fighters have, where by changing weapons, you can do different things. Like, someone's resistant to slashing damage, fine, I'll take my Warhammer out and just beat them into a bloody pulp. This guy is not letting you get close to him at all, fine, I'll bring my spear out, or my glaive, and I'll attack him from reach. Things like that. Fighters have that ability. And again, because the kind of defining feature of the fighter or the fighting man, whatever you want to call it, is they use weapons. Giving them the ability to switch between weapons can be very, very powerful. For the monk, I really like the idea of stances that change how it works, because, again, I studied martial arts for 20 years. And if you look into Kung Fu specifically, Kung Fu as a whole, which Kung Fu in and of itself is a blanket term that covers a lot, like easily dozens, if not hundreds of different martial arts styles. It's basically kind of a blanket term for Chinese martial arts. Now, that's not 100% accurate. Please don't crucify me in the comments by going, well, actually, there's a lot of Chinese martial arts that aren't considered Kung Fu. I get it, but in the West, Kung Fu, and in China, Kung Fu is a blanket term that describes a lot of different fighting styles. And one of the things that is very typical in Kung Fu is the reliance on stances. If you're unfamiliar, stances in martial arts in general are just a way of positioning your body that gives you the ability to do certain things. When I started learning Taekwondo, we learned 3 stances. We learned your basic fighting stance, which is called Matsugi. And that's standard martial arts L stance. Your front foot, or your leading foot, is pointed towards your opponent. Your back foot is pointed perpendicular to your front foot. So your feet basically form this L shape, but it's more like this. And at least in Taekwondo, your weight distribution was roughly about 70% on your back leg, 30% on your front leg. And what that did is it gave you a slightly smaller hitbox, because instead of having your whole torso, they could only hit the side of your torso. It allowed for your front arm to block most things that were going to come from you, and your back arm was already pushed back so that when you did want to punch with it, you could twist your entire torso and it would make your shoulder thrust your entire arm forward and give you a lot of power. It also had the same effect on your legs. Your front leg could be used to block. It could also be used to throw off very, very quick kicks. And then your back leg, because your hip would pivot as you kicked with it, would be your power kicks and things like that. That's your basic fighting stance. We also learned another stance called sitting stance, and it was entirely a conditioning stance. It was, you put your feet about double shoulder width apart. You would bend your knees, and you'd sit like this. In Kung Fu, in karate, I think as well. It's a lot of times it's referred to as horse stance. And it's this very, very strong stance, and really the only thing you can do in it is punch. And that's what we used to do, is we'd get into a sitting stance, and then we just punch over and over and over again. And the third stance we had was called walking stance, and it was specifically designed, instead of the L shape, you had both feet like this, just spread out pretty far, and it was a movement-based stance. And really the only time we ever used it was when we did this kick called a rising front kick, which was a front kick, but you hit with the top of your foot. It was very rarely used. If you look at Kung Fu, stances are a massive, massive part of kung fu in general, and each one will do different things. You have the various animal styles of kung fu. You have like monkey and tiger and dragon, and each one you do different strikes. You emphasize different things. And a really, really good example of that is if you watch Avatar: The Last Airbender, the cartoon. Each one of the bending styles is actually based on real martial arts. Airbending is based on a martial art called Ba Gao. And that particular martial art puts a huge emphasis on circles and circular movement. One of the more famous things that is used in conjunction with Ba Gao is they do... trying to remember if they do the moon knives or they have the big ones. They have a couple special weapons that are almost exclusively used in that style. However, if you look at earthbending is based on a style of kung fu called Hung Gar. And Hung Gar is a power style. It has these really strong, wide stances. Everything is very, very strong and rock-like. And so if you watch airbenders moving around and doing things, you can watch as airbenders are constantly moving and creating these circles which turn into these wind currents. Whereas you watch earthbenders move and they're boom, 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 ha. It's very hard and very rough. And part of that is the style. Part of that is the stance that they're in. You could not do these really big flowery movements in a Hung Gar sitting stance style thing because you're just too rooted there. So the stance for Ba Gao is this very kind of small mobile stance. Your feet are actually remarkably close together and you're constantly moving with it. When you look at firebending, and I have said this wrong in videos before. I can't remember if it's Northern Shaolin or Southern Shaolin, but it's one of the Shaolin styles. And theirs is this very explosive aerial style. I mean, you watch them using it, they get into this style and they jump, and because of how they stand, their legs are put in just the right position where they can get aerial really, really quick. And they can do these flying kicks and punches and things like that. It's a very kind of acrobatic, aggressive style. And then you look at waterbending is Tai Chi, which a lot of people, when they think of Tai Chi, they think of old people in the park going, ooh, ooh. The thing about Tai Chi is it's all about controlling momentum. And there is, I've actually studied some combat Tai Chi, because when you speed up the very slow rhythmic movements of Tai Chi, it goes from ooh to foo. And it's all about conserving the momentum you have and controlling the momentum of the conflict. So the idea of stances and stuff like that that they do in Pathfinder Sister Second Edition, I think from a game design aspect, fits into the feeling of the monk really, really well. And it gives a limitation that is really, really important. Again, if a monk can do everything that a fighter can do, but doesn't have to spend money and time on weapons, then you're going to make the fighter feel useless. However, if you allow a monk to specialize in certain things through stances or something like that, or give them the ability for their attacks to do different things, you're not going to be completely handicapping the fighter, because we've already talked about the thing that makes game design for a fighter interesting is giving them more than just a attack. Give them battle master maneuvers. Give them something that they can do in addition to attacking or because they attack. In MMOs, we call them proc effects. Basically, when you attack, there's a chance that something will happen with it. Tabletop RPGs, percentage-based attacks, or percentage-based procs just don't really work that well. Unless the percentages are very, very high, and even then you have to start dealing with dice rolls that you don't want to play around with in D100s and all that. It just slows the games down. But with the monk, giving them something where when you're in this stance, your attacks do this. Whereas if you change to this stance, your attacks do this. Or when you're in this stance, your movement does this. Whereas this stance, the movement does this. it gives you a control aspect that allows you to, a limiting aspect that allows you to limit what the monk can do at any given point, but it feeds into that monk fantasy of, I have a solution for this, I just have to get into the correct stance for it. And again, I'm not 100% happy with how they deal with stances in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, because they turn into effectively feat trees, which I don't think are fun. But the idea behind it, I think, is really, really good. And I think from a game design perspective, that's a fantastic way to design a monk, is give them effectively a switch that allows them to change how they interact in combat and out of combat. And again, it doesn't need to be limited. So many people, again, talking about 5th edition, so many people limit the monk to how much damage can you do, what kind of damage you can do. They limit everything to combat. I think the monk, especially when I played my monk in the Adventurers League, I was not useless in combat. I was decent in combat. But one of the things that people used to tease me about, I would forget to roll damage when I did my attacks. Because again, the focus, when I was playing the monk, my focus was generally never on, let's see how much damage I can do. Most of the time, it was about, let's see what kind of useful thing I can do this round. So a lot of times it was stunning, or moving characters around, or interrupting spells, forcing concentration checks and things like that. And I was just, damage was a secondary. Oh yeah, and also I do damage. So you don't need to focus everything, which is what Pathfinder does with their stances. Their stances are exclusively, this is how combat works. You don't have to limit it entirely to, when you're in a different stance, you're in combat, and it just changes how you can kill things. Making movement-based stances is a real thing. There are certain stances that are significantly better at movement. Monkey style kung fu is a very acrobatic style of kung fu, and involves a lot of movement. If you look at drunken boxing or drunken fist, which has gotten to the point, and I guess it has been for a long time, it's this almost mythic style. A massive part of drunken boxing or drunken fist kung fu is the movement aspect of it, is the fact that in drunken boxing in general, a lot of the strikes that you get are not punches. The strikes will be shoulders or hips and things like that, because the entire aspect and the entire purpose of drunken boxing is to be as unpredictable as possible and to do things that your opponent is not expecting. Part of that is your movement. You want to be able to move around and get to places that your opponent is not expecting to be attacked from. And so you'll kind of swagger over here, and you'll lean over here, and then you'll come with a back fist to the back of their head because you've just leaned forward and come back like this. Things like that. So having movement be integrated with your stances, or going the full 4th edition route of movement is a part of your actions, your attacks, will make, from a class design perspective, will make the monk play very, very differently. And again, it will be complicated, but when you want to give that class fantasy feel of, I can do things other characters can't, all I need is my body, I have some kind of supernatural aspect to it, and I'm in control of every situation because I have some sort of solution somewhere, those things work really, really well. So yeah, a combination of stances and movements linked to attacks and things like that, I think tends to make the most fun monks to play. I'm not saying that, elemental monks where they can cast spells and stuff like that, I'm not saying that that's not fun or anything like that. Like in Baldur's Gate 3, I have a monk character. They're Shadow Monk. And they're still a lot of fun. I use my Shadow Step a lot because it's super, super fun. But it's a video game first of all, and it's a very combat heavy video game, and so a lot of the aspects of the monk that I enjoy the most just don't really exist for the Baldur's Gate 3 version of the monk. It's still really fun, and they give you gloves that allow you to have pluses to your damage and attack rolls that don't exist in 5th edition but should. So you don't feel completely like a second-class citizen. But yeah, I think from a game design perspective, the monk really does need to have, in the same line as either the ranger or the thief, they should have some of the emphasis of the class should be on non-combat, out-of-combat things, the hypermobility, the kind of improved durability of their body. Those things can all be really, really good outside of combat. And then, even in combat, you want to lean to that hypermobility, and you want to give them the ability to interact with the environment in ways that just other classes can't. And like I said, two of the more interesting examples of that are the 4th edition monk, that every attack has a special movement skill linked with it, or the Pathfinder 2nd edition monk, where they have various stances that they can learn and specialize in to give themselves more things that they can do in ways to kind of vary their attacks and abilities. So yeah, like I said, that's my idea for the monk. Like I said, anyone that's watched this for any amount of time, I'm a monk main. I love monks, and the idea of a monk that could switch stances and has attacks that link to movement, to me, that would be the most fun monk to play ever. And by creating a stance system, you already have the ability to start introducing different styles of monks, which is what the subclass system in 5th edition does, where you have like your open palm monks and your shadow monks and all that stuff. With a stance system, you can simply allow them the ability to use different stances or specialize into different stances. You don't need an entire subclass system to do that. It's just if you learn this stance, you get access to these things. Like maybe if you learn the shadow stance, you get the ability to, shadow step and stuff like that, as long as you're in this stance. But it means that your attacks are somehow different. Or maybe you get the Phoenix stance, and that allows you to actually add fire damage to your attacks, but it also makes you susceptible to movement. Like anytime you get hit, you get knocked back or something because you are flying, literally. You don't have as good a hold on the ground or something like that. Have pluses and minuses to stuff like that, but a stance system in and of itself gives you a lot of options. And it's also something that can be used for other things, because stances are not an exclusively Eastern martial arts thing. When you look at HEMA, Historic European Martial Arts, it's people going around with like long swords beating the snot out of each other. It's really, really cool, by the way. There are different ways that you can hold your sword that gives you different options. If you look at fencing, there are different stances that you can do, and different kind of pairings of weapons that all allow you to do different things depending on where you're holding your blade. If you look at things like Kendo and Bushido, where you hold your katana or your, I can't remember what they're called in Kendo, your Kendo stick, they have a name for them, completely changes what you can do. There's a stance where you have it held out like here, there's a stance you have it here, there's a stance you have it here, and there's a fourth one where you actually have it pointed at the ground. Each one of those opens you up to different attacks that are more effective at it, and it allows you to make different strikes just by holding it in a different place. So stances don't have to be exclusively to monks. However, again, if you want to give that monk fantasy, monks should have access to specialized stances that are exclusive to them, and they probably should have access to more stances than other classes to make it feel really cool. Anyway, that's my idea on monk. I hope you guys found this interesting. In the comments down below, First of all, what are your opinions on monks? I know there are a few people that think monks have no place in D&D or fantasy-based RPGs in general because they're replicating Europe and China's not in Europe. And my response to that is always, where do you think spices came from? They didn't come from Europe. They had connections to, they used to call it the Orient back then, going back to like the 12 or 1100s, I think even before that, with Marco Polo and that. My history is really, really bad. But yeah, the idea of martial artists not existing in medieval Europe just isn't a thing. They were extremely rare because they were half a world away, but it was a thing. But still, I am interested. Do you guys, first of all, do you like the idea of monks in tabletop RPGs in general? Do you prefer them to not show up in your fantasy-based ones? Do you not like them in your modern-based ones because everyone has guns, so why would you ever shoot stuff? Let me know in the comments down below. And do you have a favorite monk character? Whether it's a character you built, a character that you watched on, TV in a movie, something like that. Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, again, that's all for me today. I will see you guys in the next time. All right? Bye-bye.